The sea was restless that morning, rolling against the rocks like it carried a secret it couldn't quite keep. The town of Windmere woke slowly beneath a pale gray sky, its rooftops damp from a night of quiet rain. Elora Hayes walked along the narrow cobblestone path toward the old post office at the corner of Seaford Street, clutching her shawl tighter as the wind brushed her cheeks with salt and chill. 3 days until her wedding, she reminded herself. 3 days until she would stand beneath the church archway and promise a kind man a steady love she wasn't sure she could give. The bell above the post office door gave its familiar, gentle chime as she entered. The scent of polished wood and old paper wrapped around her like a memory. Behind the counter stood Mrs. Whitcomb, small, round, and kind-eyed, with a bun so neat it could have been drawn with a ruler. She looked up and smiled warmly. "Oh, morning, dear. Your invitations came, I reckon?" Elora nodded. "Yes, ma'am. I was told they'd be here by today." Mrs. Whitcomb began sorting through a small stack of parcels. "A fine thing, a wedding. Always stirs the heart, doesn't it? And you, marrying that fine man from the Brant family. You must be over the moon." Elora offered a polite smile. "Yes, he's very good to me." But the words felt like folded paper, neat, careful, and empty of weight. The older woman handed over a bundle tied with twine. "All addressed proper. Lovely choice of lettering, dear." Elora thanked her softly, but her attention snagged on another envelope sitting apart from the rest. Yellowed, its corners softened by time. Her name was written across it in handwriting she hadn't seen in years. The loops, the tilt, the pressure of each line, unmistakable. "So, Elora Hayes," she read under her breath. Mrs. Whitcomb followed her gaze. "Ah, that one. Found it tucked behind the sorting drawer this morning. Heaven knows how long it's been there. Looks like it got itself lost." Elora reached for it carefully, as if it might vanish. "Wheat do vanish." Her fingertips brushed the ink. Faded, but still alive somehow. On the top corner, smudged yet visible, was the sender's name, Callanward. Her heart stumbled. The shop around her seemed to fade, replaced by the sound of a boy's laughter carried by the wind near the cliffs. Callan, the boy who'd written poems in the margins of his school books, who'd walked her home each evening and told her the sea kept their secrets safe. The boy who vanished the year the world went quiet. The date on the envelope read, May 7th, 5 years ago, the day he left. "Elora, are you all right, dear?" Mrs. Whitcomb asked, noticing the color drain from her face. She blinked, forcing herself back to the present. "I'm fine. I just wasn't expecting this. Letters have a strange way of finding their time," the woman said with a knowing smile. "Sometimes they wait until we're ready to read them." Elora nodded faintly, clutching the letter to her chest. "A thank you." Outside, the wind had picked up, carrying the scent of the ocean across the street. The world seemed quieter somehow, as though the moment she stepped outside, time itself had shifted slightly. Just enough for the past to breathe again. She made her way down toward the shore, the letter still in her hand. The sea stretched out before her, endless, silver gray, whispering its eternal song. She sat on the old stone bench by the letterbox, the same spot she and Callan used to share after school. They had written each other letters they never mailed. Small secrets folded into paper, sealed with promises only youth could believe in. The lighthouse stood in the distance, its faded paint glistening faintly under the clouded sun. She could almost see them there again. 2 teenagers chasing waves, laughing between gusts of wind, dreaming of worlds bigger than this little town. Her eyes fell to the envelope again. The paper trembled between her fingers. Should she open it? She could still feel the weight of that first connection, the tender kind that arrives before words ever do. In those early days, Callan was the boy everyone almost noticed but never truly saw. He lived with his mother in a small cottage near the lighthouse. His father had left long ago, and his mother's health was frail, leaving Callan to carry more than most boys his age. Yet he never complained. He read constantly, scribbled endlessly, and believed in stories the way other people believed in prayer. Elora had been drawn to him like a moth to candlelight, both cautious and compelled. She started writing him notes tucked between library books, sometimes simple things. Did you ever finish that story? Or what do you think the sea would say if it could speak? He always answered. Not with letters of his own, but with fragments written in unexpected places, inside returned books, beneath her desk, in the folds of paper cranes left at her doorstep. His handwriting became the map of her days, each message a whisper of something unspoken. One afternoon, they met at the lighthouse for the first time outside of school. The tide was low, the rocks glistening beneath a pale sun. Callan carried a small leather-bound journal, the edges worn soft from years of use. He handed it to her without a word. Inside were pages filled with stories, unfinished ones, all about two people meeting by the sea. She laughed quietly. "You never finish them." He looked at her with that thoughtful calm. "But some stories aren't meant to be finished," he said. "They're meant to be felt." From that day on, the lighthouse became their place. They would sit for hours, talking about everything and nothing, dreams, fears, the future. Elira told him she wanted to paint the sea one day, not the way it looked, but the way it felt. He said he wanted to write something that could make silence feel beautiful. Between them, something fragile and eternal began to grow. But even back then, there was a sadness in him, a quiet distance that appeared whenever the topic turned to his mother. Elira noticed how often he looked toward the horizon, as if searching for something he couldn't name. The night she found out about his mother's illness, the air had smelled of rain and salt, the world too still for comfort. Callan had come to the lighthouse, his hands trembling as he told her the truth. His mother was dying, and the doctors had said there was little time left. She remembered the way he pressed his forehead against hers and whispered, "Promise me you'll remember me as I am now," and she had promised. Now, sitting at her desk with that same trembling in her heart, she realized how deeply that promise had rooted itself inside her. 5 years had passed, and yet she had never truly stopped waiting for his voice, his letters, some sign that he had kept a piece of her too, Sue. The sound of the sea drifted through the open window. Elira picked up the letter again, her thumb brushing over his name. She wondered if he had written this before or after he left. If these words were a goodbye, or something else entirely. The paper crackled softly under her touch, the faint scent of old ink rising with it. Her reflection in the window looked pale, almost ghostly, the rain making trails of silver down the glass. She thought about Noah again, his patience, his certainty. How he had once told her that love wasn't meant to hurt, that real love was calm, dependable. She wanted to believe him, yet, as she held that letter, she couldn't ignore the truth her heart already knew. The calm had never moved her the way the storm once did. The kettle whistled behind her, but she didn't rise to pour another cup. She only sat there, listening to the sound fade into the distance like the echo of another time. Outside, the rain began to fall harder, tapping against the glass like 1,000 unanswered questions. Elira pressed the letter to her chest and closed her eyes, letting the memories pull her under one more time. The boy who wrote in the margins still lived somewhere in the folds of her heart, and the ink he left there had never truly faded. The rain had not stopped by evening, and Windmere seemed wrapped in a kind of hushed melancholy, the sort that made every sound feel softer, every shadow longer. Elira sat curled on the window seat, her legs drawn beneath her, the letter still unopened on the small table beside her. The fire burned low, its glow flickering across her face. She had spent the day moving through her house as though she were a visitor, touching familiar things and feeling an unfamiliar distance in them. Everything seemed fragile tonight. Her walls, her calm, even her breath. She reached for the letter again, the edge of the paper catching the light. How many times had she picked it up today only to set it back down? It was more than fear. It was reverence, perhaps. Reverence for something that had once been too alive to touch. The past had become a ghost that lived quietly between her books, her paintings, her dreams, and now it had returned in the form of a single forgotten envelope. She glanced toward her easel in the corner. The canvas there had been unfinished for weeks, a seascape painted in muted tones of gray and blue. She had meant it to be peaceful, but it wasn't. It looked lonely. Like a sea that waited for someone who would never return. Outside, the wind pressed against the windows, making the old panes shiver. Elira could almost hear his voice in it, that calm, steady tone he used when reading her his stories. She used to tease him about his pauses, the way he let silence hang between sentences as if the words needed air to survive. Now that silence seemed everywhere. Her eyes drifted toward the shelf beside her desk. Callan's journal sat there, his old one, the one he'd given her on their last day at the lighthouse. The leather was worn, the pages yellowed, the corners frayed. She had not opened it in years. Slowly she reached for it, brushing dust from its cover. When she untied the strap, the faint scent of sea air and ink filled the room, as though time itself had bent for a moment. The pages whispered when she turned them. His handwriting filled them slanted, uneven, alive. Some pages were filled with short stories about the sea, others with observations about people and dreams and loss. But near the back, she found something she'd forgotten existed. A pressed wildflower, long since faded, its petals pale and fragile. Beneath it, written in his hand, were the words, "For the day I cannot find the words to say I love you." Elara's chest tightened. She closed her eyes, pressing her fingertips to the page. That sentence felt heavier than any she'd ever read. It carried everything unsaid, everything lost, everything lost. She thought of his mother, of the way Callan had looked that last night before he vanished. His eyes had been full of fear, not for himself, but for her. He had promised to write. He never had, until now. She looked at the letter again. It sat there quietly, patient as the fire crackled, and for a moment she almost tore it open. But something stopped her. What if it wasn't what she wanted it to be? What if it was goodbye all over again? A knock at the door startled her. She hesitated, setting the journal aside, and went to open it. Mrs. Whitcomb stood there under an umbrella, her gray hair damp from the rain. "I'm sorry to drop by so late, dear," she said, her voice soft but urgent. "There's something I thought you should know. Elara let her in, confusion tightening her chest. "What is it?" The old woman closed her umbrella carefully, glancing around the room as though the walls themselves were listening. "That letter, the one from this morning. I remember now. It wasn't supposed to be lost. It was kept." Elara frowned. Elara frowned. "Accept? What do you mean?" Mrs. Whitcomb sighed, her eyes distant. "A Callan brought it to me himself the day before he left. He asked me to hold on to it, to deliver it only if he didn't come back. He said it contains something that might hurt you if read too soon." Elara's breath caught. He told you that?" The woman nodded. "He looked terrible that day." "Pale as moonlight. I thought he'd been ill. He just asked me to promise I'd make sure it reached you when the time was right. I'd nearly forgotten until I found it this morning." Elara leaned against the table, the room spinning slightly around her. Why would he ask that?" Mrs. Whitcomb gave her a long, sympathetic look. "Because he loved you, dear. Sometimes love keeps secrets it thinks it must. And sometimes it leaves ghosts behind instead." When she left, the house felt heavier, as if her words had settled into the air like dust. Elara sank into her chair again, staring at the letter that now seemed almost alive. So, it hadn't been lost by chance. It had waited for 5 years just as she had. The fire had nearly gone out. Shadows crawled along the walls. Elara opened the journal again, her hands trembling, her pulse loud in her ears. She flipped through the pages, searching for something, she didn't know what. Then, at the very back, she found a folded scrap of paper, different from the rest. She unfolded it slowly, unsolely. It wasn't a story this time, it was a letter. One she'd never seen before. The ink had bled slightly from dampness, but the words were still legible. "If I ever leave and can't find the courage to return, please know that I tried to protect you from the worst of me. I am not what I was. The sea took something from me, and I don't know if I'll ever be whole again." Her hands trembled as she read the last line. "When the time comes, you'll know why I couldn't say goodbye." The wind howled outside, and a faint chill passed through the room. Elara set the journal down beside the unopened letter. Her heart ached, torn between fear and longing, between knowing and not knowing. The firelight flickered across the paper, turning the edges gold. Somewhere deep inside her, a truth was beginning to stir. Whatever Callan had written in that letter, it was not just a confession. It was a key. Morning came gray and quiet, the kind of morning that blurred the edge between dream and memory. The rain had started again, a steady rhythm against the glass, soft but endless. Elara woke before dawn, the letter still resting on her nightstand, untouched. It felt almost like another presence in the room, watchful, waiting. She rose slowly, wrapping her robe around her and standing by the window. The town below was veiled in mist, the sea beyond it moving in muted silver waves. There was something different about the rain today. It fell heavier, slower, almost thoughtful, as if the sky itself carried the same questions she did. She made tea without tasting it, her mind replaying Mrs. Whitcomb's words from the night before. The letter had been meant for a time when Callan wasn't coming back. But he had come back, hadn't he? Or had he? She couldn't be sure anymore. It had been years since anyone in Windmere had spoken his name. The boy who vanished. They called him, with that quiet sympathy, people reserve for the kind of loss they can't explain. Elara had stopped correcting them long ago. By mid-morning, the restlessness became unbearable. She took the letter from the nightstand, slipped it into her coat pocket, and stepped out into the rain. The streets glistened, the air thick with the scent of wet earth and seaweed. Her boots clicked softly on the stones as she made her way toward the edge of town, past the bakery, the bookstore, and the narrow lane that led down to the cliffs. She didn't know exactly why she was going there, only that something inside her needed to stand where everything had once begun. The old lighthouse stood like a memory at the end of the shore, its white paint chipped and weathered. The sea roared faintly below, gray and infinite. Elora paused at the gate, the sound of the wind tangling her hair. She hadn't been here in years, not since the day of his mother's funeral. That day came back to her now, as vivid as the smell of salt in the air. It had rained then too, but it was a different kind of rain, sharp and angry, as though the heavens had been grieving with them. She remembered standing under the same lighthouse, the ground soaked, her dress clinging to her knees. Callan had stood beside her, silent, his face pale and distant. He'd held the small wooden box of his mother's letters, and when the priest finished speaking, he'd looked at her and whispered, "I'll write you when I can think again." She believed him. But that night, the sea had taken more than rain. The cliffs had crumbled slightly in the storm, part of the old road collapsing into the waves. The next morning, Callan was gone. His house was empty, his mother's things packed neatly away. No note, no goodbye. Only silence. Elora brushed her fingers along the lighthouse wall, feeling the rough texture of stone beneath her palm. The letter in her pocket felt heavier now, as though the years between them were pressing through it. She wondered if he had been sick then, if the shadows she saw on his face that day were more than grief. Mrs. Whitcomb had said he'd looked pale, weak. Maybe it had been illness. Maybe it had been despair. Maybe it was both. The wind picked up, carrying the scent of sea spray. Her eyes drifted toward the horizon where the sky met the water, blurred and endless. Somewhere out there, she imagined him wandering the world, writing stories no one would ever read, still talking to her in the margins of pages he'd never send. A sound broke her thoughts, footsteps on the gravel path behind her. She turned quickly, heart quickening, but it was only a fisherman crossing the shore, his raincoat glistening under the drizzle. He nodded politely, and she returned it faintly before turning back to the sea. Still, her pulse didn't calm. For a moment, she could have sworn she'd felt him there, close enough to touch, close enough to hear the whisper of his voice beneath the rain. She pulled the letter from her pocket, her fingers trembling. The seal was old, brittle. She hesitated, staring at it for a long moment, then closed her fist around it. "Not yet," she whispered to herself. "Not here." The rain softened again, falling with a strange gentleness now, like memory instead of weather. She took shelter beneath the stone archway of the lighthouse and waited for the world to quiet. When she finally turned to leave, she noticed something half buried near the gate, a small rusted tin box, the kind Callan used to keep his ink pens in. Her breath caught. She knelt, brushing away the damp sand, her hands shaking. Inside was a stack of folded pages, their corners warped from time and moisture. The top page was written in his hand. She didn't open it right away. She only held it against her chest, her heartbeat stumbling in her ribs. It was as though the past had been waiting here all along, just beneath the surface, patient and unforgotten. The rain slowed to a drizzle, and the clouds began to thin, letting a weak light fall across the water. Elora looked out at the horizon once more, feeling the strange calm of inevitability settle over her. Whatever truth these pages held, it was no longer lost. It had simply been waiting for the moment when she was finally ready to listen. She turned toward the path that led home, the sound of waves following her like a promise. The letter in her pocket and the papers in her hands felt like twin heartbeats, one from the past, one from the present. She didn't know yet which one would break her more. By the time Elora returned home, the afternoon light had already faded into a soft silver dusk. The rain had eased to a mist, clinging to her lashes and darkening the fabric of her coat. She shut the door behind her and leaned against it for a moment, breathing deeply, the scent of sea salt and old stone filling her lungs. The small tin box trembled in her hands. Its weight felt far greater than its size, the quiet heaviness of something that had waited too long to be found. She placed it gently on the table beside the unopened letter. For a long moment, she simply stared at them, two messengers from the same past, both carrying pieces of him. Her fingers hesitated at the latch. The metal was rusted, the hinges stiff, but with a soft creak it opened, releasing a faint, earthy scent of paper and time. Inside were folded pages, fragile and yellowed, edges curled with damp. The handwriting was unmistakable, his. Slanted, hurried, filled with the uneven rhythm of a mind always running faster than his hand. The first page was a fragment beginning mid-thought. The doctors said it might get worse, that there's a chance I won't see another spring. But I can't tell her that. Not yet. She still looks at me like the world hasn't already decided. Elara's breath hitched. She read the words again, slower this time, her fingers tightening around the edge of the paper. Her eyes moved to the next page. I don't want her to wait for someone who might not come back. I'd rather she hates me for leaving than mourn me for staying. Her chest ached with a sudden familiar pain, not sharp, but deep and hollow, the kind that feels like memory itself has turned against you. So the secret that pulled him away, the shadow that haunted his last days in Winmere, illness, silence, love hidden behind fear. The truth that could have changed everything. She sank into the chair by the window, the papers spread before her. The world outside blurred through the glass, the rain painting the town in soft gray strokes. She tried to imagine his voice as he wrote these words, alone by candlelight perhaps, the sea outside echoing his heartbeat. The pages trembled slightly in her hand, and she realized it wasn't just the wind shaking them. It was her. She turned to the final sheet in the box. Only a few lines filled it, the ink lighter almost fading. If one day she finds this, maybe she'll understand. I didn't stop loving her. I only stopped believing I deserved to. A sound escaped her, half breath, half tear. She pressed the letter to her chest, closing her eyes as the storm outside deepened. For so long she had tried to build a life over the ruins of what they'd been. And yet, here it was again, the ghost of that first love, raw and unhealed, whispering through ink that had survived the years. When she finally looked up, the fire had burned low. The room glowed in a dull amber light, the edges of her world soft and quiet. She set the papers aside carefully and reached for the original envelope, the one Mrs. Whitcomb had given her. Her hands trembled as she ran her fingers along the seal. Now she understood why it had waited, why it hadn't been sent until now. It wasn't just a letter. There was power in not knowing, in keeping the moment suspended between hope and heartbreak. Once opened, the mystery would vanish. The letter would become truth, and truth, she knew, always demanded something in return. The rain thickened once more, steady and deliberate, tapping against the windows like fingertips. It sounded different tonight. Not like sorrow, but like remembrance. She rose and crossed to the window, watching droplets race down the glass, tracing paths that vanished into the mist below. For a brief second, she imagined she could see him through the rain, the faint outline of a boy standing by the sea, his coat dark, his head bowed, waiting for her, her throat tightened. "Why didn't you come back?" she whispered to the glass. The rain gave no answer, only the soft rhythm of eternity. Behind her, the clock on the mantel ticked quietly, each second marking the space between then and now. The house felt both full and empty, haunted and alive. Elara turned from the window and blew out the candle on the table, plunging the room into shadow. Only the faint orange glow of the fire remained, flickering over the letter and the tin box beside it. As she stood there, listening to the quiet, she realized something had shifted, not just in the air, but within her. The past was no longer distant. It was here, breathing beside her, its pulse steady and real. The rain outside began to slow, turning into a soft drizzle. She could hear the faint cry of gulls beyond the harbor, the whisper of waves against stone. When she finally returned to her room, she left the letter on the table by the window, next to the tin box. She drew the curtains half closed, allowing a sliver of moonlight to spill across the desk. The reflection shimmered faintly against the sealed envelope, turning the faded paper to silver. Lying in bed, she listened to the rhythm of the rain. It sounded like breathing, like pages turning, like a story still unfinished. And somewhere in the back of her mind, she could almost hear him again, reading aloud one of his stories by the lighthouse. His voice was softer now, carried by memory, by wind, by time itself. When she finally drifted into sleep, the letter remained unopened. But for the first time in years, she dreamed of him not as the boy who left, but as the man who had loved her enough to let her go. The morning arrived with sunlight pale and uncertain, slipping through the curtains in thin ribbons. Elara woke to the quiet hum of the house, the faint scent of rain still lingering in the air. The letter and tin box remained untouched on her writing desk, bathed in a soft golden light that made them look almost sacred. For a long moment, she lay still, listening to the soft tick of the clock, trying to convince herself that today was just another ordinary morning. One more step toward the life she had chosen. But even the silence felt altered now, heavier somehow, shaped by the words she had read the night before. Sene, a gentle knock sounded at the door. Ilara? The voice was familiar, steady, careful. Noah. She closed her eyes briefly before answering. Come in. He stepped inside, holding a small paper bag that smelled faintly of coffee and warm bread. His shirt was half-buttoned, his hair still damp from the rain. There was something comforting about the way he filled a room. Calm, grounded, his presence an anchor she could always find. He smiled when he saw her. I brought breakfast. Thought you might not have eaten. She managed a soft smile in return. You know me too well. He set the bag on the table, glancing at the desk where the letter and box sat. His eyes lingered for a second, curiosity flickering there, but he said nothing. That was one of the things she both loved and feared about him, his ability to notice everything and yet ask nothing until she was ready to speak. They sat together at the small table by the window. The sea was visible from here, its horizon painted in soft gray-blue. For a few minutes they ate in silence, the sound of forks against plates mingling with the distant cry of gulls. Noah reached across the table, his fingers brushing lightly over hers. You've been quiet lately, he said gently. Even quieter than usual? Ilara looked up, her heart giving a small, guilty twist. There's just been a lot on my mind. The wedding, mostly. He smiled again, that patient, understanding smile she'd always admired. You don't have to pretend with me. I know when something's pulling at you. She hesitated, unsure how to explain the storm inside her. How could she tell him that she had found a letter written by the man she'd once loved, the man whose ghost had haunted every corner of her life since he left? Oh, do you ever feel, she began slowly, like part of you is still somewhere else? Like there's a version of you that got left behind, waiting for something that never came? He watched her for a moment, his expression unreadable. Then he nodded. Sometimes, he said softly, but I think that's what makes us human. The pieces we lose along the way. The trick is learning how to live without needing them back. His words were kind, but they struck her in a way he couldn't have known. She wanted to believe him. She wanted to believe that moving on was just a choice, that love could be folded neatly into memory and put away. But as she looked at him, all she could think of was the boy who had left her standing by the lighthouse, the boy who had promised to write. The man whose voice still lived inside the pages she had found. Noah's gaze followed hers to the desk. That box, he said quietly. It looks old. She swallowed. It belonged to someone I used to know. Before. He nodded, his tone gentle but firm. I won't ask more, but whatever it is, whatever you're remembering, I hope it doesn't make you forget what's ahead of you. Ilara forced a small smile, though it felt fragile like a paper folded one too many times. It doesn't. I just need time to think. He reached across the table again, this time holding her hand fully, his thumb brushing the back of her knuckles. You've always needed time. That's one of the things I love about you. You don't rush through life. You feel it. Every part of it. The words should have comforted her, but instead they cut deep. Because he was right, she did feel everything. And now, feeling meant remembering. A gust of wind rattled the window pane, carrying with it the sound of distant thunder. The storm that had haunted the town for days wasn't finished after all. She glanced outside and saw the horizon darkening again, waves growing restless. Something inside her mirrored it. A quiet dread, a pull toward something she didn't yet understand. Noah rose to leave, brushing a kiss across her forehead. I'll stop by later. We still need to finalize the seating for the reception. She nodded, her voice caught somewhere between affection and ache. Of course, when the door closed behind him, the silence returned, but it was no longer gentle. It pressed against her like a weight. Ilara walked to the desk, her eyes falling on the letter once more. Noah's warmth still lingered on her skin, but her heart had already begun drifting elsewhere, toward ink and rain and a name that refused to fade. She sat down, tracing the outline of the sealed envelope. She thought of Noah's smile, steady and kind, the life he offered, safe, calm, unshaken. And then she thought of Callan, his laughter, his storms, his words written in the margins of her heart. Between them stretched a silence that had no name. The quiet between what was and what might have been. Outside, the rain began again. Almost like it was waiting for her to decide which love she would carry into tomorrow. The house was quiet after Noah left, so still that Ilara could hear the faint hum of the clock and the soft ticking of rain on the roof. She sat by the window long after the sound of his footsteps faded, watching the mist rise from the sea. The letter lay before her once more, untouched, as if waiting for her courage to finally match its patience. Her fingers brushed its surface gently, tracing the edges of the paper. She knew this moment couldn't be postponed any longer. Some truths didn't need permission, they only needed to be heard. Her breath trembled as she broke the seal. The paper inside was folded twice, its creases deep, its corners worn. The ink had faded slightly, but the handwriting was unmistakable. Callan's. The first line stopped her heart cold. You once asked me why I always wrote instead of speaking. It's because words are the only way I know how to stay alive. They keep me here even when I'm gone, and I need you to know. I didn't leave because I stopped loving you. I left because I couldn't bear to make you watch me fade. Elora's throat tightened. The room seemed to shrink around her as she kept reading. The doctors call it a heart defect. Something I was born with, something I ignored too long. When my mother passed, I found out it had worsened. Kania, I was angry, not at the world, but at my body for betraying me. I thought I had more time. I thought I could write my way through it. But then the pain came, sharp, constant, and I realized I'd never survive here. Not with you looking at me the way you did. You always saw too much. Her eyes blurred, and she had to pause. The rain outside thickened, becoming a dull roar against the glass. Her breath fogged the window, the air tasting faintly of salt and tears. I left for treatment in Bristol. They said there was a chance, but not a promise. I couldn't let you wait for a ghost. So I asked Mrs. Whitcomb to keep this letter. I told her to send it only if I didn't make it back. If you're reading this now, maybe it means I didn't. Or maybe it means I didn't. Or maybe it means I couldn't find my way home. Elara pressed a hand over her mouth to stop the sound that rose from her chest. He had been gone, not because he stopped caring, but because he was dying. All those nights she'd cursed him for his silence. All those days she'd built walls of anger just to stay upright. They crumbled now, one by one. Her eyes moved to the next lines, her vision trembling. I've imagined this 1,000 times. You, years from now, walking down to the sea with that faraway look you get when you're thinking. I hope you're happy. I hope you found someone who knows how to keep you safe. I was never very good at safety. I only ever knew how to love you in storms. A quiet sob escaped her. The rain blurred the world outside into streaks of silver. She remembered him at the lighthouse, his coat flapping in the wind, his smile half shy, half daring. She remembered how he told her once, some loves don't end. They just wait for new seasons. Sten. And now here he was, waiting still through ink and distance and the slow passing of years. If I survive this, the letter continued, I'll come back when I'm strong enough to face you. And if I don't, promise me you'll still go on. Promise me you'll keep painting, even if the sea looks different without me. That's all I ever wanted, to be a part of the light that keeps you alive. Her tears fell freely now, soaking into the edge of the page. The ink smudged beneath her fingertips, blurring his last written words. You were the only thing that ever made the world feel like home. Elara folded the letter back carefully, her movements slow, reverent. She held it against her heart as if it could still carry his warmth. For a long time she just sat there, her body trembling, her mind caught between grief and something far quieter, peace. The truth had finally found her. It wasn't the kind she had expected, nor the one she thought she wanted, but it filled every hollow space left inside her. He hadn't abandoned her. He had loved her so fiercely that he'd chosen to vanish rather than let her watch him fade. It was a kind of love that both broke and healed her at once. When she finally rose, the sky had darkened again, the wind brushing softly against the windows. She walked to the small mirror near the door, catching her reflection. Her eyes red, her lips trembling, but her face somehow softer than before. She looked like someone who had just met the truth after years of walking in its shadow. She turned back toward the desk, her gaze falling on the tin box. The papers inside now made sense. The fragments, the confessions, the apology written between every line. She closed the lid gently and placed the letter on top, aligning them as though uniting two halves of the same soul. Outside, the storm eased. The rain slowed to a mist, and in that stillness, she felt it. Not absence, not pain, but a strange and fragile gratitude. She whispered into the quiet, her voice shaking but certain. He read it, Callan. I finally read it. The sound of her words disappeared into the air, carried by the wind that swept past the house and out to sea. Somewhere beyond the horizon, she imagined him hearing it and smiling. The morning unfolded beneath a sky so pale it looked almost bruised. Windmere had quieted after the storm, the streets washed clean, the air smelling faintly of salt and lilies. The world moved as if unaware of the weight pressing on Elara's heart. Tomorrow, she was meant to marry Noah. Tomorrow, she was meant to begin a life carefully planned and beautifully safe. Yet, as she stood at her window, the letter clutched in her hand, nothing felt real. The words she had read the night before still echoed through her, each one a pulse beneath her skin. She had slept barely an hour, her dreams filled with shifting faces. Callan standing on the cliffs, his hair whipping in the wind, his voice lost beneath the sound of waves. Every time she tried to speak, he would fade into mist. When she woke, she found herself whispering his name into the dark, as if the walls might carry it to him. And now, the house hummed with quiet preparations. Her wedding dress hung near the mirror, its ivory folds glowing in the soft morning light. The scent of roses drifted in from the bouquet resting on the dresser, but even the flowers felt like strangers. She moved through the room slowly, touching the small details she'd chosen, the ribbon for her hair, the pale shoes by the chair, the earrings Noah had given her. Everything was perfect, and yet she felt as though she were watching another woman's life unfold. By noon, Noah arrived with his usual calm smile. He looked impossibly composed, his gray coat brushing softly against his knees, his expression filled with quiet certainty. "You should rest," he said, setting down a basket of pastries on the counter. "Tomorrow's going to be long, and everyone's expecting you to shine." She smiled faintly, though her chest ached at the word shine. "I'm fine," she said. "Just a little tired." He studied her for a moment. "You've been distant lately," he said gently. "If there's something wrong—" "There isn't," she interrupted too quickly. "I promise." He didn't press further. That was his way. Patient, kind, unwilling to push against her silences. He reached for her hand instead, his touch warm and steady. "You know you, Elara. You carry storms in quiet ways, but you don't have to do it alone." His words were tender, but they landed in her chest like a stone, because she knew that somewhere inside her, another storm had already begun, one that had nothing to do with the weather and everything to do with a letter written in fading ink. When Noah left that afternoon, the house seemed too still again. The clock ticked, the air thickened, and the sky began to darken toward evening. Elara wandered to the desk where the letter now lay folded once more. She ran her thumb along the crease, feeling the pulse of every word within it. Callan's confession had changed something fundamental in her, though she didn't yet understand what. He had loved her, truly, deeply, painfully, but that love had lived in silence, hidden behind time and distance. Now that it had found her again, it was as if all the air in her world had shifted. She couldn't ignore it, not now, not when every heartbeat whispered his name. By dusk, the air turned heavy with rain again. She slipped on her coat and stepped outside, her breath misting in the cold. The streets were mostly empty, the lamps flickering pale gold against the gathering fog. She walked without purpose, her boots echoing against the cobblestones, until the path curved toward the shore. The lighthouse loomed ahead, its faint beam cutting through the dim light. The wind carried the smell of sea salt and memory. She stood near the railing, her hair tangled by the breeze, her eyes fixed on the water. How many nights had they stood here, she and Callan, speaking of futures they never had? The world had felt so vast back then, so full of promise. Now it felt smaller, quieter. A world she barely recognized. As she turned to leave, movement caught her eye near the edge of the cliffs. A dark figure standing in the fading light. Her breath froze. The man was still facing the sea, his coat whipping in the wind. She couldn't see his face, only the outline, but something about his posture struck her deep in the chest. The tilt of his head, the stillness, the familiarity of someone who had once belonged to her. Callan? The name left her lips before she could stop it, fragile as a prayer. The figure turned. For one dizzying second, their eyes met, and the world seemed to stop. It was him, older, leaner, his face marked by time and distance, but it was him. Callan Ward, alive. Elara's hand flew to her mouth. The waves crashed harder against the rocks below, the rain beginning to fall in thin streaks that blurred the edges of everything. He didn't move toward her, not yet. He only looked at her. His expression caught somewhere between disbelief and apology. The air between them trembled. She stepped forward once, then again the wind tugging at her coat. Her voice broke through the storm. You're here," she whispered. "You're really here." He nodded slowly, his gaze steady on hers. "I shouldn't be." he said quietly, the sound of his voice raw and familiar all at once. But I couldn't stay away. For a long moment, neither of them moved. The rain fell harder, washing the distance between them into something fragile and real. She wanted to speak, to ask 1,000 questions, to tell him how many nights she'd waited for his name to stop hurting. But no words came. Only the sound of the sea, the same sea that had carried their silence for 5 long years, rose between them. Finally, Callan took a hesitant step closer. "You got my letter," he said. It wasn't a question. Elora nodded, tears mixing with rain on her cheeks. "I did." His lips curved in a broken, almost smile. "Then you know everything." She shook her head. "No," she whispered. "I don't." "Not yet." The wind surged again, scattering droplets between them, the scent of salt heavy in the air. And in that suspended breath between thunder and heartbeats, she realized something profound. Tomorrow might belong to her wedding, but tonight still belonged to him. For a long moment, neither of them moved. The storm murmured around them, the sea restless beneath the cliff, and the rain stitched silver threads between their faces. Elora's heart thudded in her chest, too loud, too fast, as if trying to make up for 5 years of silence. Callan stood a few paces away, his hands shoved into the pockets of his worn coat, the collar turned up against the cold. He looked older, not just in his face, but in the way he carried himself. The boy who once dreamed in the margins had turned into a man shaped by distance and loss. She took a step closer, her breath trembling. "I thought you were dead." His eyes lifted to hers, a flicker of sorrow passing through them. "Some days I was." The words were soft but heavy, weighed down by everything left unsaid. They stood in the rain, unsure of how to close the space between them. The lighthouse behind them hummed faintly, its beams sweeping across the horizon, momentarily illuminating his face. She saw the faint scars near his temple, the hollow beneath his cheekbone, the exhaustion tucked behind his calm. "I read your letter," she whispered. "Every word." He exhaled, his shoulders sinking slightly. "Then you know why I left." "I know what you wrote," she said, voice shaking. "But I don't know why you never came back. You promised you would." He turned his gaze toward the sea, the waves reflecting dim flashes of light. "I tried," he said quietly. "After the surgery, there were months I couldn't even walk to the window. I didn't think I'd ever see this place again. When I finally could, when I was strong enough, I came back, but you were gone." "I wasn't gone," she said, tears spilling despite herself. "I was here waiting. Every letter that didn't come, every day that passed, I was still here." He looked at her then, the corners of his mouth twitching in a ghost of pain. "Elara, I went to your house. They said you'd left for the city." "I thought you had moved on." "I only left for a few months," she said, voice barely above the sound of rain. "Well, my aunt was ill. When I came back, you weren't here. And no one told me you'd returned. The air between them thickened with the weight of lost years. It felt cruel. How easily fate had tangled 2 lives meant to find each other sooner. The wind pushed against them, but neither moved away. Callan's voice broke the silence. "Nye used to come here every evening. Even when I was still sick, I'd climb that hill just to see the sea. It made me feel like I hadn't completely disappeared." Elora glanced at the lighthouse door, rusted and half open. "Did you ever think I'd find you?" He gave a faint, sad smile. "I hoped. But I didn't expect it. Some things feel too impossible even for hope." The beam of the lighthouse swung across them again, and for a fleeting second, their faces glowed in the same light. 2 souls caught between what was and what could never be again. She wanted to reach for him, to touch his face, to confirm he was real, but her hand stayed at her side. "You should have told me," she said quietly. "You should have let me choose whether to watch you fade or not." His eyes met hers, sharp with emotion. "And what would you have chosen?" "The truth," she said simply. "Always the truth." He stepped closer then, the rain catching in his hair, his coat dark and heavy. "The truth is," he said, his voice trembling for the first time, "I never stopped loving you. Not for a single day. But when I thought I'd lose you anyway, I thought letting you go was the kindest thing I could do." Elora's breath hitched. Only the quiet ache of understanding, the bittersweet recognition that love could survive even when everything else had changed. She closed her eyes against the wind. "You broke me," she whispered, "and I still can't hate you for it." When she looked up, his expression faltered, the lines around his eyes tightening. "If I could take it back." "You can't." she interrupted softly. The beam from the lighthouse dimmed slightly as the storm passed further out to sea. Callan's hand twitched at his side as though he wanted to reach for her, but wasn't sure he had the right. Elara took a small step forward, closing the distance between them until she could see the drops of rain clinging to his lashes. "You're here now," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "That's all I ever wanted." He looked at her with something that might have been relief or grief. Perhaps both. "We don't know how long I'll stay," he admitted. "I wasn't supposed to come, but I had to see you. Even just once, before." Before what? The unfinished sentence hung between them like fog. She didn't ask. She was too afraid of the answer. Instead, she reached for his hand. His skin was cold, but alive beneath hers. The touch was small, simple, and yet it felt like everything. The sea murmured softly below, the world slowing around them. For a brief, impossible moment, it felt as though time itself had folded, letting them exist outside of all the years lost. Then quietly, he whispered, "I shouldn't have come." Elara's eyes met his. "Then why did you?" His lips parted, his breath visible in the cold. "Because I couldn't forget the sound of your name in the rain." The words broke something inside her, soft and final. The wind shifted, and the lighthouse beam swept past them one last time, throwing their shadows long against the stones. She realized with a trembling certainty that the man before her was both the beginning and the end of something she'd never stopped believing in. The rain had slowed to a whisper by the time they found themselves walking side by side along the cliff's narrow path. The world wrapped in a silvery haze. Neither of them spoke at first. The air between them pulsed with all that had been left unsaid, with years that couldn't be reclaimed. The sound of the sea below was rhythmic, endless, like the echo of their shared silence. Elara stole a glance at him in the dim light, at the curve of his jaw, the shadow beneath his eyes, the faint tremor in his breath. Callan Ward was no longer the boy she remembered, yet somewhere beneath the weariness and years, she still saw him, the one who had once written her name in the margins of his stories. They stopped near the old bench overlooking water, the same place where, once upon a lifetime, they had spoken about futures as if they were guaranteed. Callan brushed his hand along the damp wood before sitting down, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "I used to come here when the pain got bad," he said quietly, "when I couldn't sleep." The sea was the only thing that sounded like breathing. Elara remained standing, her arms wrapped around herself. "You came back here," she said softly. "To Winmere." "After all this time?" He nodded. 2 weeks ago. I didn't mean for you to know. I didn't mean for you to know. I thought I could stay long enough to see this place again, then leave without disrupting anything." She turned toward him, disbelief flickering across her face. Disrupting anything. "Callan, I'm supposed to be married tomorrow." He winced slightly, looking down at his hands. "I know. Then why are you here?" He didn't answer right away. Instead, he reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small, worn notebook, the same kind he used to carry everywhere. "Because," he said finally, his voice low, "I never stopped writing about you. Every story, every unfinished line, it always came back to you. I thought if I came here, maybe I could finish one without her in it." Elara's throat tightened. "And did..." He looked at her then, his eyes dark with something she couldn't name. "No, I never could." The words hung between them, heavy and tender, and the wind brushed strands of her hair across her face, and before she could push them away, he reached out, hesitating for only a second before tucking them gently behind her ear. His fingers lingered for the briefest moment, just enough to make her heart tremble. "Well, you shouldn't have come tonight," he said softly. "You deserve peace. You deserve someone who can promise you a whole life." "You're here now," she replied, her voice breaking. Callan's hand fell back to his side. "You're because every day I told myself I could live without you. And every night I dreamed about you standing here. I just needed to see if the dream was still real." The clouds began to part above them, a faint silver glow spreading across the water. Moonlight spilled over the cliffs, softening everything it touched. Elara sat down beside him, close enough to feel the warmth of his shoulder through his coat. "And now that you've seen me?" she asked quietly. He turned to her, a faint smile ghosting his lips. "And now it hurts worse than before." They both laughed then, not from amusement, but from the unbearable ache of truth. The sound was fragile, like something that had waited too long to be spoken aloud. For a while, they said nothing. The night stretched between them, full of the hum of wind and the distant cry of the sea. Elara closed her eyes, breathing in the salt air. It smelled like memory, like endings and beginnings tangled together. I used to think love was something you could outgrow. She said finally, that if you built enough walls, it would fade. But every time I try to move on, something pulls me back here. To this town, this shore, this... Her voice trailed off, lost in the rhythm of the tide. "Me," Callan finished softly. She nodded. He looked out toward the horizon again, his eyes reflecting the shifting silver of the sea. "But do you ever wonder what would have happened if I'd stayed?" "Every day," she whispered. "But wondering doesn't change anything, does it?" "No," he said, his voice faint. "It only hurts differently." They sat until the night deepened, until the stars began to scatter like dust across the sky. Callan leaned back, his breathing slow, his shoulders finally easing as though he'd been carrying a weight too long. Elara watched him, the contours of his face soft under moonlight, and something inside her ached with impossible tenderness. She wanted to reach out, to trace the years away, to tell him she forgave him, even if he hadn't asked. But she didn't move. She only whispered, "I thought time would fix us." He smiled sadly, eyes still closed. "A time doesn't fix love, Elara. It just teaches it how to ache quietly." The words settled between them like a truth too old to argue with. When dawn began to break, faint streaks of gold brushing the edge of the sea, neither of them had moved. The world seemed to hold its breath. The light touched his face first, turning the gray in his hair to silver, the lines around his eyes to something almost gentle. He opened his eyes slowly and looked at her as though seeing her for the first time again. "Elara," he said softly, "if this were 5 years ago, I'd ask you to stay." Her eyes filled, but she managed a trembling smile. "And if this were 5 years ago, I would have said yes." The gulls began to cry over the water, calling the morning into being. She stood first, brushing dew from her skirt. "I should go," she murmured. "They'll be looking for me." He rose slowly beside her, nodding. "I know." They stood facing each other, the dawn stretching between them, not as a promise, but as a goodbye neither of them could name. Callan reached for her hand one last time, holding it as though memorizing its shape. "Thank you for coming tonight," he said quietly. She looked up at him, her voice barely more than breath. "I didn't come for the past, Callan. I came because I never stopped believing you'd find me again." The first full light of morning spilled over the cliffs then, painting the sea gold. For a moment, it felt like the world had turned just for them. Then Elara pulled her hand gently away and began walking back toward the town, her figure fading into the light. Callan stood alone by the bench, the waves rising and falling below. And in the silence that followed, the hours between dusk and dawn finally gave way to the day that would change everything. The morning arrived soft and pale, the kind of morning that looked as if the world was holding its breath. A thin mist curled over the rooftops of Windmere, and the church bells rang faintly in the distance, 3 gentle chimes that echoed through the quiet town. Elara woke before the sound ended, her eyes already open, her body still and cold beneath the blankets. For a long time, she didn't move. She could still feel the damp air from the cliffs on her skin, still hear Callan's voice in her head, that last whisper before dawn. "If this were 5 years ago, I'd ask you to stay." Her hands found the edge of the blanket, clenching it tight against her chest as if to keep herself from unraveling deep. Through the air, the world beyond the window was gray-blue, the horizon still veiled in a faint shimmer of fog. Somewhere out there, she knew, he was awake too. Maybe sitting by the sea. Maybe watching the same sky the same morning that was supposed to belong to someone else. She rose slowly, wrapping her shawl around her shoulders. The house was silent except for the faint tick of the clock and the whisper of the wind through the window panes. On the chair by her desk, her wedding dress hung. Ivory, silk, and lace, still untouched, still perfect. The sight of it made her chest tighten. It was beautiful, yet it felt like something borrowed from another woman's life. Elara crossed to the desk, where Callan's letter still lay folded beside the tin box. The ink on the pages had dried into memory now, but she could still hear the rhythm of his words when she read them in her mind. "You were the only thing that ever made the world feel like home." She reached out and brushed her fingers over the paper as though she might feel the pulse of his hand through it. Then she drew her hand back quickly, as if touching it too long might change everything. A soft knock broke the silence. "Elara," it was Noah's voice, calm, measured, steady. She turned, forcing a breath before answering. "Come in." The door opened, and Noah stepped inside, his suit jacket draped over his arm, his tie slightly undone. His hair was damp, and his eyes, kind, always kind, met hers with a warmth that twisted something inside her. "You're up early," he said. "Chastity stepthly." "I thought you might still be resting." "I couldn't sleep." He smiled faintly, though it didn't reach his eyes. "Big day. I suppose it's allowed." She nodded, but the words caught somewhere in her throat. He walked closer, placing the jacket over the back of the chair. "The florist came early," he said after a moment. "The roses look beautiful. You should see them before we head to the church." "Roses," she repeated absently, her gaze drifting toward the window. Outside, the mist had begun to lift, the sea glimmering faintly beyond the rooftops. The world looked ordinary again, yet it felt like standing on the edge of a choice she couldn't take back. Noah followed her gaze. "It's going to be a clear day," he said. "It seems like a good sign." She forced a small smile, her voice barely steady. "Yes, a good sign." He turned to her then, studying her face the way someone studies a fragile object they aren't sure how to hold. "Elura," he said quietly, "I need to ask you something, and I want the truth. Not the kind that sounds polite." She looked at him, startled. "What is it?" He hesitated, his hands slipping into his pockets. "Last night, you were gone. I called, but you didn't answer. And when you came home, you looked like someone who'd seen a ghost." Her breath caught, but she said nothing. "Well, I didn't ask then," he continued, his voice calm but firm, "because I didn't want to know something I couldn't fix. But if there's something, someone, that still holds your heart, tell me now. Before we stand in front of everyone and promise things neither of us can keep." The silence between them deepened, filling the room like water. Hilara's heart pounded so hard she thought he might hear it. She wanted to speak, to tell him that she cared for him, that he was good and kind and safe, but that somewhere deep inside her, another name still lived, carved into the bones of her heart. She wanted to tell him that love wasn't always fair, that sometimes it refused to fade no matter how much you begged it to. But the words wouldn't come. She only looked at him, her eyes full of everything she couldn't say. Noah sighed softly, the faintest trace of sadness in his expression. "It's in his expression." "I think I already know," he said. "I saw it the first time I held your hand. The way you flinched, like you were afraid to let go of something invisible." Tears stung her eyes. "And Noah, I never meant to." He raised a hand gently, stopping her. "You don't have to explain. I just needed to know if I was asking you to build a life in the shadow of someone else's memory." The clock ticked once, twice, then the world fell quiet again. She wanted to tell him she could try, that maybe with time she would learn to love him differently, if not more. But he deserved more than half a heart. He reached out then, his touch soft against her cheek. "You're a good person, Elura. I think maybe that's why it hurts, because I know you'll blame yourself even when you shouldn't." She caught his hand, holding it tightly for a moment. "You deserve someone who doesn't look back," she whispered. He smiled, sad but tender. "Maybe, but I'd still rather have you here now, even if your heart is somewhere else." Outside, the bells began to toll again, slow, solemn, distant. The town was waking and the day was beginning, indifferent to the storm unfolding quietly in that small room. Noah took a step back, slipping his hands into his pockets again. "I'll be at the church," he said softly. "Whatever happens, I'll understand." And then he left, the door closing with a sound so gentle it broke her completely. Elura stood there for a long time, staring at the empty doorway. The air still smelled faintly of his cologne, but already it was fading. She turned back toward the window. The mist had lifted entirely now, revealing the open sea, vast, silver, endless, and somewhere beyond the horizon, she imagined Callan watching the same morning light, perhaps wondering if she would choose the life waiting for her, or the one she had never truly left. Elura didn't move for a long time after Noah left. The sound of the closing door lingered in the air, fragile and final. Outside, the church bells faded into silence, and the faint hum of morning settled over Windmere once more. The world went on, unaware that hers had stopped. The wedding dress still hung by the window, its pale fabric glowing faintly in the light, a symbol of a promise she could no longer make. She turned toward it slowly, the weight of realization pressing through her chest. She couldn't go through with it. Not out of defiance, not even for Callan. But because to say yes now would be a lie neither she nor Noah deserved. She crossed the room, each step small and deliberate, and rested her hand against the fabric of the gown. I'm sorry, she whispered, though she wasn't sure to whom, to Noah, to herself, or to the life she was about to leave behind. Then, without another glance, she turned and walked out of the house. The streets were still damp from the night's rain. The cobblestones gleamed beneath the rising sun, and the smell of the sea hung thick in the air. She walked quickly, her pulse keeping rhythm with the faint sound of waves in the distance. The world around her was quiet. Too quiet. As though the town itself were holding its breath for what she might do next. Her destination was already clear in her mind. The post office stood near the edge of the square, its small sign swaying in the breeze. She had gone there countless times over the years, but never like this, never with her heart caught between the past and whatever waited beyond it. When she reached the door, she hesitated, her hand hovering over the worn handle. Then she stepped inside. The familiar chime of the bell echoed softly through the room. Mrs. Whitcomb looked up from behind the counter, her spectacles catching the light. The older woman's expression softened when she saw Ilara, but she said nothing at first, as if she already sensed what had brought her here. "Morning, dear," she said gently. "You're out early, and on your wedding day no less." Ilara swallowed hard. Her voice came out quieter than she intended. "I won't be going through with it." Mrs. Whitcomb's hands stilled. She said after a moment, her tone neither shocked nor judgmental. Gewurchtmental. "So, it's come to that." Ilara nodded faintly, her gaze drifting toward the rows of small wooden cubbies behind the counter. "Ye came to return something." The postmistress tilted her head. "Return." Ilara reached into her coat and drew out Callan's letter, the one that had started everything. The paper was creased and softened from where she had held it again and again, as if afraid it might disappear if she let go. She placed it gently on the counter. "This belongs here," she said softly. "It waited 5 years to find me. Maybe now it needs to wait again." Mrs. Whitcomb regarded her for a long moment, her eyes kind and full of a quiet understanding that came only from a lifetime of seeing hearts break and mend in the same small town. "You know," she said finally, "letters have souls of their own. They find their way when they're ready. And they're ready. Perhaps this one's journey isn't over yet." Ilara smiled faintly, her throat tightening. "And maybe not." The older woman reached out, laying her hand gently over Ilara's. "Some letters don't need to be sent again, my dear. Sometimes they just need a place to rest. But I'll keep it safe, as I did before before." "Shades?" Ilara nodded, relief and sadness intertwining in her chest. "Thank you," she whispered. She turned toward the door, the small brass bell jingling softly as she stepped back into the sunlight. The breeze lifted the edge of her coat, carrying with it the faint scent of salt and roses from the church nearby. She paused on the steps, glancing back once more through the glass. The letter lay on the counter, still and peaceful, as if it had finally found its way home. Outside, the world felt strangely new. The sky had cleared completely, streaks of pale blue stretching endlessly over the sea. The church bells began again in the distance, marking the hour that should have been her wedding. People were gathering near the square, their voices distant and muffled. Ilara turned away from them and began walking toward the cliffs. Her feet carried her by instinct, following the path she knew too well. The winding trail past the dunes, the tall grass bending in the wind, the faint scent of rain still clinging to the air. She could see the lighthouse from a distance now, standing tall against the horizon. Its light wasn't needed in the daylight, but somehow it still felt alive, watching over her. When she reached the top of the cliff, the sea opened before her in endless blue. The wind pressed against her coat, and she closed her eyes, letting it wash through her. She thought of Noah, Allah's steady kindness, the calm way he had understood what she couldn't say. She thought of Callan, his restless heart, the words he'd written, the life he had given her without ever meaning to. And she thought of herself, the girl she had been, the woman she had become, standing now on the threshold of something uncertain, but finally true. A gull cried overhead, cutting through the silence. Ilara opened her eyes. The horizon shimmered, and for just a moment she thought she saw movement far down the shore. A solitary figure walking near the water's edge, coat dark against the sand. Her breath caught, her pulse quickening. But when she blinked, the figure was gone. The wind shifted, carrying the scent of the sea up the cliffs. She smiled faintly, not in sadness, but in understanding. Some ghosts, she realized, didn't need to be seen to be real. With one last glance toward the water, she turned and began walking back toward town, her steps light, unhurried. Behind her, the waves continued their endless rhythm, steady, unbroken, eternal, and somewhere, carried on that same wind, was the faint whisper of a name that would always belong to her. The afternoon light carried a strange calm as Elara followed the winding path down toward the beach. The tide was low, leaving long, glistening stretches of sand behind. The sky hung pale and open above her, streaked with traces of gold and gray. Each step she took pressed softly into the damp earth, her thoughts moving slower than the waves. She didn't know what she expected to find at the shore. Perhaps nothing, perhaps everything. The wind swept gently through her hair, the salt brushing against her skin like a memory trying to return. When she reached the bottom of the hill, she saw him. Callan stood near the waterline, his figure framed by the endless sea, his coat flapping lightly in the breeze. For a moment, she just watched him, her breath catching in her throat. He hadn't seen her yet, and something about the sight, his stillness against the movement of the ocean, made the world tilt. He looked both present and fading, as though time itself couldn't decide which way to keep him. Huh. She walked toward him slowly. Her shoes sank into the wet sand, each step marking her approach with quiet resolve. He turned at the sound, his eyes finding hers instantly. There was no surprise in them, only a weary kind of knowing. "He thought you'd be at the church by now," he said softly. "Oh, he couldn't," she replied, her voice unsteady but sure. "It wouldn't have been right." Callan looked away toward the horizon, where the sun was beginning to wane. "He's a good man," he said. "A better than most." "Yes," she said. "That's why I couldn't lie to him." He gave a small nod, as though he had already expected her answer. The waves lapped quietly at the shore between them, the rhythm of the sea keeping pace with the silence that fell. When he finally spoke again, his voice was low, roughened by something she couldn't name. "I didn't come here to ruin anything," he said. "I told myself that if I saw you again, I'd keep my distance, that I'd just know you were alive and happy. That would be enough." "But it wasn't," she said gently. He gave a small broken laugh. "No," he admitted. "It wasn't? It never is it? It never is it? You can lie to yourself about everything except the way your heart betrays you." Elara moved closer, the hem of her dress brushing the tide. The distance between them had grown too heavy to bear. "You should have told me," she whispered. "You should have let me choose to stay, even if it meant watching you fade." He looked up at her then, his eyes bright in the dimming light. "I couldn't," he said. "You were the only thing in my life that wasn't broken. I didn't want to make you carry my ending." Her hands trembled. "You weren't a burden. You weren't." She stopped, her voice cracking. "You were the only thing that ever made sense." He stepped forward, the wind catching his words as they fell. "I wanted to tell you 100 times, he said. "When I left for the hospital, I wrote you every day. I tried to send the letters, but I never could. I'd hold them in my hands and think, if you read these, you'll wait for me, and I didn't want you to wait. I wanted you to wait." Her breath shuddered out of her. "And yet here we are," she said quietly. "A still waiting. He smiled faintly, a sad, tired thing. "Maybe we were always meant to." The sound of the sea deepened around them, the waves rising and falling like a heartbeat. She took another step toward him, until they stood close enough for her to see the fine tremor in his hands, the exhaustion beneath his calm. The air between them was electric, full of years of silence, full of words that had never found a voice. "I'm leaving again," he said finally, his tone barely audible over the wind. "Tomorrow morning." Her eyes widened. "You just came back." "I wasn't supposed to stay this long," he said. "My health, it's not what it was. I came to make peace with this place, with what I left behind, with you." Tears stung her eyes, blurring the edges of his face. "Peace?" she echoed, her voice trembling. "You think I can find peace knowing you're leaving again?" He reached for her hand then, his touch fragile but steady. "Elara," he said softly, "I don't want you to wait for another goodbye. I just wanted to see you once more, to tell you that you didn't break me. You saved me, even when I was too afraid to let you know." Her fingers tightened around his. "Don't say goodbye," she whispered. "Not again." He looked down, his thumb brushing across her knuckles. "Then let me say something else," he murmured. "The truth I never gave you." The wind stilled for a moment, the air holding its breath with her. "I loved you then," he said. "Not in the way boys love, not with promises or plans, but with every part of me that still knew how to feel alive. I love you still, though it hurts to admit it. And if I have to carry that love into whatever's left of my life, I will. Because it's the only part that ever felt real." The sound that escaped her was half sob, half sigh. She reached up, her palm brushing the side of Ella's face. His skin was cool, the faint stubble rough beneath her touch. "Then why does love always arrive too late?" she whispered. He closed his eyes, leaning into her hand. "Maybe it doesn't," he said. "Maybe it just finds us when we're ready to understand." The sea crashed softly behind them, the spray kissing the edges of her dress. She leaned closer, her forehead resting against his, and for a fleeting moment, the world disappeared. No church bells, no promises, no years lost. Only the sound of their hearts, beating quietly in time with the waves. And when they finally stepped apart, the sky had turned gold at the edges, the sun dipping low behind the water. Callan looked at her one last time, his eyes full of 1,000 unsent words. "Goodbye, Laura," he whispered. She shook her head, tears falling freely now. "No," she said, her voice breaking. "Not goodbye. Not this time." He smiled then, a small, aching thing, and turned toward the horizon. She watched him walk along the shore until the mist swallowed his figure completely. When the wind rose again, she thought she heard his voice carried faintly through it. Not a farewell, but a promise, soft and certain as the tide. Evening descended over Windmere with a quiet so profound that it seemed the world itself was holding its breath. The tide had begun to rise again, washing over the footprints Elira and Callan had left behind. The wind carried the scent of salt and fading sunlight, the last traces of the day dissolving into the sea. She stood there long after he had gone, her eyes fixed on the horizon where the mist had swallowed him whole. Every wave that broke along the shore felt like a heartbeat. A steady, relentless reminder that time would not wait for her to decide. By the time she made her way back toward town, the lamps had begun to flicker to life along the narrow streets. Their golden glow painted soft halos on the wet cobblestones, and the air had cooled to a gentle chill. Each step she took felt heavier, yet more certain. The path split ahead. Einen road leading toward the church, where people would still be waiting, confused whispers likely already spreading. The other toward the sea's edge, where the wind would erase every trace of her if she asked it to. She stopped at the crossroads, her breath visible in the cold air. For the first time in her life, there was no one to tell her which path to take. No expectations, no promises, no safety nets. Just the raw weight of her own heart, fragile and trembling in her chest. The image of Noah's face filled her mind, his calm eyes, his quiet understanding, the steadiness that had always felt like shelter. He would forgive her, she knew. He would carry her absence like a wound, but he would heal. He deserved a love that stayed, not one haunted by what could have been. And then there was Callan, the boy who wrote his soul into words and left pieces of himself scattered like letters across the years. The man who came back, not to claim her, but to tell her that he still loved her, even when it cost him everything. He was chaos and poetry, the ache and the truth she had never learned to live without. But his body was frail, his future uncertain, his love as fleeting as the tide that pulled at her ankles now. The world around her seemed to blur. The sound of the waves merged with the echo of her own heartbeat. The church bell struck once, far away, its tone low and distant. She closed her eyes, the weight of both men, both worlds, pressing against her. For years, she had lived her life trying to choose what was right. But tonight, beneath the dim light of a fading sky, she realized that love was not something that could be reasoned into or out of. It was a current. Unyielding, unpredictable, impossible to control. And sometimes the heart's choice wasn't the safe one. It was simply the true one. And the wind shifted, carrying with it a whisper of the sea, the faintest echo of Callan's voice in the air. "I never stopped loving you." Her tears came then, not of sorrow but of surrender. She turned from the church path and began to walk back toward the cliffs. The climb was slow, the path uneven, but she didn't stop. When she reached the top, the sea stretched endlessly before her, the moonlight turning the waves silver. The lighthouse loomed in the distance, its beams sweeping across the dark. She could almost imagine him there, sitting where he always had, his notebook open, waiting for her. Elira stepped closer to the edge, the wind tugging at her coat. Her heart felt like it was breaking and healing all at once. This was the place where everything had begun, and maybe where it would begin again. She sat on the same stone bench where they had once carved their initials. The letters faded now, but still visible. Pulling a small piece of paper from her pocket, she unfolded it slowly. It was blank, the first page of her sketchbook torn free before she left the house. She took the pen from her coat and began to write, her hand trembling with the weight of what she needed to say. Callan, if you read this, know that I didn't choose safety. I chose truth. I chose the ache, the beauty, the uncertainty. I chose you, not the boy who left, not the man who returned, but the part of you that never stopped loving me. If our story ends here, let it be because it was too full to contain, not because it was unfinished. Wherever the tide carries us next, I'll find you in every line I draw, every breath I take by the sea. When she finished, she folded the paper and placed it under a small stone on the bench. The wind caught at her hair, tugging it loose as if urging her forward. She stood, looking once more toward the dark line of the horizon. For the first time, she didn't feel lost. She felt alive. A faint sound carried through the wind, the distant hum of a motor, small and uneven. She turned toward it, her pulse quickening. A boat silhouette moved through the mist near the docks, the figure at its bow barely visible, but familiar. Her breath caught in her throat. Callan, he hadn't left yet. Without thinking, she began to run, the cold biting at her face, her steps slipping on the wet stone. The closer she got, the clearer he became, his coat flapping, his hair windblown, his gaze fixed toward the open sea. He turned at the sound of her footsteps, eyes wide as she reached the dock. Callan, her voice broke through the night, carried by the wind. Honey. He froze, then stepped forward, his hand reaching out instinctively. She took it, breathless, trembling. The space between them closed with a single look, not of reunion, but of recognition. Neither spoke. The sea roared below. The moonlight caught on the water, and in that suspended moment, time seemed to dissolve. Elara's voice came out barely a whisper. I made my choice. He looked at her, his expression unguarded, full of wonder and disbelief. And what did you choose? Her lips trembled into a smile that was both sorrow and joy. You, the world, fell away then, leaving only the sound of the tide and the warmth of his hand in hers. Whatever came next, the storms, the distance, the uncertain days ahead, no longer mattered. For the first time in years, her heart was quiet, not because it had found peace, but because it had finally found its truth. A single wave broke differently, slower, gentler, as if carrying something toward her. Elara's breath caught when she saw it. A small, pale shape tumbling in the surf, glinting faintly under the gray morning light. She stepped forward, the cold water curling around her ankles, her fingers trembling as she reached down. It was another envelope, edges damp, ink blurred, but still legible and equal. Her name again. Elara Hayes. Her pulse quickened. The one on her table had ended with a promise, a look for me where the sea meets the sky. She clutched the first letter to her chest and opened the one the tide had brought her, the paper soft and worn, the ink bleeding in places where the sea had touched it. The handwriting was the same, Callan's. A second message. His voice seemed to rise from the page as she read, each word alive and fragile. I didn't mean to leave this one behind. It wasn't for you to find this way, but perhaps that's how things are meant to be. Washed back to you by the sea that always carried our story. By now, you know the truth. My body has grown tired, but my heart has never once stopped beating your name. Her hands shook as she read, her tears mixing with the salt water on the page. If this is my last letter, let it be more than goodbye. Let it be a beginning. I want you to paint again, Elara. Paint the sea, the rain, the things that never stay still. Paint until you forget what it means to wait for someone, because love like ours doesn't end. It becomes something else. It becomes the color of the morning sky, the whisper of waves against stone, the silence that follows a name spoken softly in the dark. Elara pressed the paper to her lips, her breath shuddering. The tide reached higher now, lapping at her knees. But she couldn't move. The world around her had fallen away. There was only the wind, the sea, and the echo of his voice inside her chest. You once told me that every soul leaves behind an unfinished story. This is mine. You're the part that made it worth writing. When you look at the sea, think of me not as gone, but as home. The horizon was always where I belonged, and now it's where I'll wait. Her vision blurred entirely then, the words smearing into shapes of blue and gray. She folded the letter gently, her fingers tracing the final line before she could bring herself to read it aloud. The sea responded with a low, rolling sigh, as though acknowledging her. She stood there for a long time, her feet buried in the wet sand, both letters clutched against her heart. Somewhere, between the rhythm of the tide and the breath of the wind, she could almost hear him, his laugh, faint and familiar, carried across the distance between life and whatever lay beyond it. When she finally turned toward the cliffs, the sun had begun to break through the clouds, spilling light across the water. The sea shimmered in hues of silver and pale gold. For the first time in years, she didn't feel the ache of waiting. She felt something softer, something deeper. Peace. At the top of the hill, she paused and looked back. The waves reached for the shore again, retreating gently. She opened her hand, the letters trembling in the wind. One she kept. The other, the one the sea had given her, she let go. The paper lifted, spun once in the breeze, and fell into the water, where it drifted out toward the horizon, folding into the movement of the waves until it vanished completely. The moment stretched, suspended between sorrow and release. She wiped the tears from her cheeks, her breathing steadying. Somewhere deep inside, something had shifted, a quiet certainty that love had not left her. It had simply changed its shape. By the time she returned home, the world had brightened. The cottage glowed faintly under the morning sun, its windows reflecting the light. Inside, the air was still. She laid the remaining letter on her desk, beside her paintbrushes and unfinished canvas. The surface was blank, waiting. She sat down and dipped her brush into the first color she reached for. Blue. The state of calm seas and lost time. With the first stroke, she felt it, the world opening again, the ache transforming into something almost holy. Her hand steadied. The colors began to move. Outside, the waves continued their endless rhythm, carrying with them a voice she would never forget. And though he was gone, she felt him in the brushstrokes, in the light on the water, in the gentle whisper that moved through the air as if he were standing just behind her, saying her name the way he always had, quietly, reverently, as though it was the last word he would ever need. Years passed, and Windermere changed in the quiet way that small towns do. The paint on the shop fronts faded to softer shades. The cobblestones wore smooth under the weight of countless mornings, and the sea kept its faithful rhythm, endless, unchanging, patient. Elara stayed in her cottage by the cliff, her world no longer defined by waiting, but by the stillness that comes after a storm. Her hair had grown longer, streaked faintly with silver at the edges, and her hands, once trembling from heartbreak, now trembled only from the wind when she painted by the open window. Her art had begun to fill the rooms, canvases leaning against every wall, each one alive with the movement of light and sea. People came from towns beyond Windermere to see them, to buy them, to ask about the stories hidden beneath the colors. But she never told them the truth. She painted not to sell, not to preserve, but to remember, to keep his voice somewhere close. Each stroke carried a whisper of Callan's words, of the night he told her love never ended, only changed form. On a late autumn evening, 5 years after the tide had carried his final letter to her, Elara returned from the shore, carrying a basket of shells. The air was crisp, the horizon painted in shades of fading amber. She set the basket on the table and lit the small lamp by her window, its glow spilling softly over her desk. The same desk where the last letter had once waited. The same desk that now held her life in brushes and pigment and silence. She was reaching to hang her shawl when she saw it, something new resting on the windowsill. A small, weathered envelope, its paper yellowed and edges frayed. For a moment, her breath caught in her chest. She hadn't seen handwriting like that in years, yet she knew it instantly. That same slant, that same uneven loop in the letters. Her name, written in the familiar ink of memory, Elara Hayes. The world around her seemed to still. She moved closer, her hand trembling as she reached for it. The seal was cracked but intact, as if time itself had guarded it. The air inside the cottage shifted, heavy with the scent of sea salt and something faintly metallic, like the ghost of a storm long past. She sat down at her desk, her pulse loud in the quiet, and unfolded the fragile page. The ink was faint in places, but the words were clear. If this letter finds you, then somehow the sea has kept its promise. I sent this one before the others, though I never knew if it would reach you. Maybe I needed one letter that could travel farther than I ever could. One that would wait for its time. Elara's vision blurred, her heart tightening with something between awe and grief. When I wrote this, I didn't know if I'd make it back. I only knew that if I didn't, you deserved to hear something that wasn't goodbye. You once told me you loved stories that ended with hope, not because they denied sadness, but because they dared to believe in something beyond it. So this is mine, hope. Her breath shook as she turned the page. If I'm gone, promise me you won't let the ending be silence. Let it be color. Let it be laughter. Let it be the sound of waves against stone. Paint our story in light, not in loss. Let it be seen, even if no one knows what it means. That way, some part of us will always be alive, in strokes of blue and gold, in the quiet between rain and sea. Tears filled her eyes, but this time they didn't fall. There was no despair left in them, only the gentle ache of remembering something beautiful that had once been hers. And if, someday, you walk by the shore and the wind changes, listen closely. I'll be there, not as a ghost, not as a memory, but as the part of you that still believes love is worth every kind of pain. You are my story, Elara. The one I never finished because it was never meant to end. The ink trailed off faintly near the edge, and beneath it, one final line. Yours always, Callan. Her fingers rested over his name, tracing the curve of the letters. The sound of the sea drifted faintly through the open window, gentle and steady. May. Outside, the sky deepened into twilight, the horizon bleeding into the quiet shimmer of the ocean. Elara folded the letter with care and placed it beside the first one, the pair now resting together like the beginning and end of a circle that had taken years to close. She leaned back in her chair, eyes following the movement of the waves through the window. A faint smile curved her lips. She rose, crossed to the easel in the corner, and dipped her brush into a jar of deep gold, the color of dawn. Her next canvas was blank, waiting. She took a deep breath and began to paint. Slow and deliberate, the sea, the horizon, the light where it met the sky. Her hands steadied as she worked, her heart moving in rhythm with the brush. Somewhere within that rhythm, she could almost hear him again, his laughter soft and near. And as the light shifted over the water, it felt, just for a moment, as if he was standing behind her once more, his voice a whisper in the air. You found me. Elara smiled through the tears she didn't try to hide. I never lost you, she whispered back. Outside, the tide turned, drawing out toward the horizon where sea and sky became one. And in that space between them, where all things meet and begin again, it felt as though love itself was still writing. Quiet, infinite, eternal. Eternal.